Hello, hello. Sorry, can you guys hear me? Hello, hello. Hey, Anna, are you able to hear me? Can you hear me now? Oh, that's strange. I'm able to hear myself on my other computer. Hello? Can you guys hear me? Ah, perfect. Very strange. Anna, are you able to hear me as well?
Yes.
Fabulous. Well, yeah, if you don't mind, could you pull up the chat from the sidebar? I'll tag you in it right now. Hopefully there's no echoing, but again, like, thank you so much for coming to our AMA session. We're really excited to chat with you. And if you don't mind starting with a little self-introduction, and then we can go into the main asking questions part. Thank you so much.
Yeah, for sure. Absolutely no problem. I'm very happy to be here today. My name is Ana Lucia, and I'm a generative artist. I work with different themes, but one of them that is a recurring theme in my work is working with textiles and different systems of how textiles are created. And yeah, Nicole asked me to be part of this cohort as on the mentor side, and that really excited me because I'm myself also a alumni of the vertical crypto art residency. I think I was the second or third cohort. It was not focused on fashion, but just a general residency. So I'm really happy to be back here as a mentor and kind of I got a lot from participating in the residency, and it's really nice to kind of give back to this community in this way. And yeah, you're very welcome to ask. I'll continue my introduction in a little bit, but like feel very free to just drop questions into the chat, or if you just want to speak up. I don't know how previous AMA have gone, but I think that's very easy for me. And I've also kind of just pulled up some tabs of some of my projects and some presentations that I've done over the years. So kind of like if if there's no really direct questions, but you have more like, oh, could you tell me something about this? I'm happy to dive into that. I've got like one talk that I've done before about how to teach yourself generative art. I've done a talk where I go deeper into my Loom project. I've pulled up some tabs of my G-Span project. So, just drop in the chat if any of those things like really interest you, and I can dive into that as well. It doesn't have to be like very direct questions. Maybe while you guys ponder on that, I can dive a little bit more into what I do. If I say I'm a generative artist, I know that there's people, like when I'm talking with other generative artists, they're like, well, I just call myself an artist. I don't want to limit myself to being just a generative artist. I personally feel very comfortable in that label of like, yes, I'm an artist, but definitely I would describe my practice as generative. I think that comes through in kind of two parts in my work. That one of them is kind of like the obvious answer, working like kind of coming from the NFT space, where I make my work with computer code, and this computer code often involves a certain amount of randomness. So that's like the generative generative is the only cool thing to do. Yeah. No, I don't agree, but I think it is a cool thing to do, yeah. Not the only cool thing, though. So I work with computer code. It has an element of randomness. So it is about, there is a lot of kind of artistic intent in setting up the system, the coded system, but then there's actually almost no intent on the side of the actual outcomes, because that's determined by this randomness. And this is something that really fascinates me. So this relinquishes of control. So that's kind of, so the obvious part about I'm a generative artist is because I work with computer code and I use randomness in my computer code. But then like the other side of it that I also really like to think in my practice, and just who I kind of am in my personality and how I perceive the world around me and how I look at the world, is that I always look at things in a very, very systematic way. I'm always kind of like breaking things out in a system and thinking like, how can I build this system back up again in my way that is then through computer code, but I could imagine it taking a lot of different shapes or forms, and then trying to see like, oh, but where can I actually move in this system? What are actually all the ways that this system can express itself and come into being? So that's like the more, I would say, like bigger approach to, I think, what I mean when I talk about generative art, kind of like working with systems and relinquishes control. I'm sure if you talk with other generative artists, they'll have a different they'll have a very different view on that, but that's me. I don't know, should I keep talking, or do you already have a question for me, Yinga, or like a direction that you would want me to go into?
Not particularly. It'll take them a couple minutes to start coming up with questions, but I think we'll have a couple people
See
already
some people
interested in the chat.
typing, so wait for that. I'm also curious if I can actually share my screen, because that will be cool that you guys actually have a bit of like a
Yeah, of course. Yeah, you should be able to do that. You should be able to see a little like arrow.
you'll have like an idea of what I'm talking about. Oh, but I do want to see, wait, because I do want to see the chat, so I'm gonna do this differently. I'm gonna pull this one into a different window, and I'm gonna share the other window so I can still I have control over what I share, but I can still see all of you in the chat. Just gonna pull up
Perfect.
a cool
It looks great.
sketch. I'll wait for you guys to put in some answers. There you go. Cool. All right. Okay, so the first question is, how has your process evolved after the residency? And what is your vision for the future of generative art in the context of digital fashion, in the sense of designing, in a more of a fashion sense, and any projects that follow that term? Yeah, thank you so much for your question. Let me answer the first one of like how my process has evolved after the residency. I think what was especially good for me in the residency is that the being a generative artist, there's already quite a strong community of generative artists online, and I'm quite embedded in that community. But I felt it was really important to actually also explore outside of that community, because I think digital art is so much broader. And for example, you can apply it to things like fashion, and other design disciplines as well. So what I thought was really exciting about participating in the residency is to actually be part of such a diverse cohort, not like diverse in my core cohort, at least, like diverse in so many different ways, in practice, in people, where people were based, where they were coming from, their identities, their level of experiences. And I think that was really, really nice to be exposed to. And I think it gave me a lot of kind of maturity, in the sense that maturity as an artist, I kind of rolled into this NFT space. So I think my process has evolved in a way that I've been able to look at things just a lot like broader, and with a better foundation. And then, what's my vision for the future of generative art in the context of in the context of digital fashion? Um, I would like to answer that more without even saying like just generative art in the context of just fashion in general. Like, I'm almost surprised that there are not more projects out there combining the two. Because when I think about fashion, I actually studied fashion for 1 year, before I went into engineering and math. Anyways, so 1 year, don't know how much I can say about this, about fashion and the subject in that sense. But I would say like fashion is very much about expressing yourself and showing your individuality, and maybe showing the world a little bit of what you are about. Like, I think even people are saying like, I'm really not into fashion. I think whatever you're wearing is expressing something. And with generative art, that gives you such an opportunity to create a lot of unique products in a very, very quick way, because you build up that system. And for example, that can be applied to like a very obvious thing that could be applied to, obviously, like patterns, or like the way things are knitted, or the way things are woven. I would love to already like see a lot more of that, but you could even take it broader. I could see that you could actually, if you combine somebody with a knowledge of generative art with somebody who, for example, has a lot of knowledge about pattern making, I think you could even go like way beyond the context of just generating patterns, for example. So I think that's what I would say, and I think that is gonna be happening in the future. I mean, you see, for example, already brands moving into the NFT space, like a Mercedes or other car brands, or there's like whiskey brands moving into the NFT space, and I'm sure fashion brands will follow, and also combine that with physical counterparts. And I am actually working on a project at the moment, where we want to use, where we are gonna work on this concept of fashion is about expressing yourself. So we are going to give a possibility to the user to express themselves in a certain way, and that will be the input for a generative system, which will translate into a fashion item. So I'm very excited about that. Okay, I see. I'm just going to read the things that are on the screen now to see which way I'm going to go through things. Interested about my reverse engineering process with code. All right. Did you come from art or computing background? I'll start talking about that a little bit because I mentioned it a little bit already. What programming languages or software do you primarily use in your work and why? I think I'll start with Victoria and then like answer Callista and then move on to Celine. So I already mentioned a little bit whether I come from an art or computing background. Um, so since I was young, I've always been very interested in both art and mathematics. But unfortunately, being into art and being into mathematics is just a very uncomfortable combination. And I struggled with that for a very long time and wasn't actually able to find a meaningful way to combine these things. So after high school, even though having done like all the electives in the advanced maths, I went to art school and I actually went to study fashion design. And unfortunately, I quickly realized that there was no math involved anymore, which I maybe could have which I might maybe knew going into it, but I didn't know I was gonna miss it so much. So I left art school after a year, and I actually studied math and engineering, and I am technically specialized as a wastewater treatment engineer in development countries. So that's a whole different side of me. But it was only after university that I discovered processing. So that goes a little bit into the question of Calista. Processing is a programming language that was developed already in 2001. I unfortunately only discovered it in 2019 by Casey Rees and Ben Fry. And it's based on Java, and it is specifically developed for artists and designers to work with code. And it was for me when I discovered processing after studying and starting working as an engineer that I finally found that place where my interest in math and my interest in art could really be combined, and that like discovery has just kind of escalated since then. That's why I'm here today. Just I couldn't stop working in processing from the day that I found it. I was just making sketches for myself continuously and teaching myself continuously how to work with that. So I started out with processing. Why? Because it is specifically made for artists and designers. Then after that I moved, but processing isn't very, because it's based on Java, it's not very suitable for the web or to run in your web browser. So then I moved to P5.js, and P5.js is based on JavaScript. So P5.js is kind of like a sister of processing. It's very similar, but then based on JavaScript. So it's still super accessible for artists and designers. There's also a ton of resources online to actually teach yourself this or learn how to work with this. So I think why it is a really good entry point. Now, since a few years now, I'm like a lot more confident in coding now that I just know a lot better what I do, and it's really, I feel quite confident. I also just work sometimes in only JavaScript and not rely so much on the P5 library anymore. And also since a year, I've been starting to work a lot with like WebGL and shaders, but I would say WebGL and shaders are a little bit more kind of like advanced coding languages. I wouldn't say that it's necessarily very difficult, but it's a different way of thinking that for me it took some time to wrap my head around. So if you're just getting started, like P5.js would be my recommendation. Oh yeah, I'm so happy to hear that you've started exploring P5.js last week. I'm gonna get into my reverse engineering process a little bit. I see another question popping up on the screen though. Okay. Oh, I like that question. The system or something nice. Don't know if this makes sense. Yeah, what's the art, the code or the output? But let me go into the idea of reverse engineering first. Let's see. Here we go. Be a bit small. The thing is, I don't want to go full screen because I kind of want to see the chat. Is it readable like this? Is it big enough? I make this screen bigger. All right, I'm just gonna keep it like this. So for the reverse engineering part, I think both my Loom project, also a project that I've done with the G-Span quilters are actually quite good examples. I think Loom was my first project where I really did this. It's called Loom for kind of like obvious reasons. It was my art blocks project, which I released in 2021, almost 2 years ago now, I guess. Yeah, almost 2 years ago. And I really looked at the inner workings of a four shaft hand loom. And I started working on this because I was very inspired by the weavers of the Bauhaus school. Yeah, a group of women who were mostly working with textiles at the Bauhaus school. The reason why I was very interested in working with, or why I was very inspired to do something with weaving and something with textiles is because I was actually reading about the Bauhaus school, and then I was reading about the women that went to the Bauhaus school. And it turned out that even though it was an extremely progressive school at the time, there was still this notion that I read from, I think, the schoolmaster, who said, like, women aren't really capable of thinking in 3D. So, they were kind of like nudged into the weaver workshop. They weren't encouraged to study the more like design subjects or the architecture subjects or any of that. They were like, well, just stick to the 2D. That's what your, I guess, female brains can handle. And as I told you previously, I studied math and engineering, and I worked for a long time as an engineer. And I think as a young woman working in that field, yeah, that just really captured me, triggered me. I felt really connected to that story, which is kind of sad because we're like we've moved a century, almost a century from that moment. But so I got really intrigued, and I wouldn't say that aesthetically I didn't stick very close to their work, but it was kind of like the spark that let me like, oh, let me start looking into weaving. And I think when I think about a system, to come back to that reverse engineering again, I always go first to like, what is the simplest expression of this system? What is the simplest expression of weaving? So the most simple expression of that is just, I'm just gonna layer different threads over each other randomly, as you see in this image. Like, that is the simplest way possible that you can think about it, and then you actually already have something. Start really, really small with a super simple idea or a super simple system, but then you start to think a little bit more about weaving, and you're like, well, wait a second, it's not like completely random like threads laying over each other. It's actually, you have the, let's say, the vertical threads, or I think that's the weft. And then you have the thread that actually goes up and under and up and under underneath it, which is the warp. So we already start to kind of like go a little bit like a step up in that system of like, oh, can we make this a little bit more complicated? Can we like add something to it actually? And I think about like, oh, so how can I actually capture that in code? And although it looks here as if it's threads going over each other and under each other, they're all actually little rectangles, choosing which one is on top and which one is at the bottom. And then, so yeah, I wanted to make that a little bit more a little bit more complicated, and I started looking at these uh, four shaft hand looms, as you see on the picture. It's called the four shafts because it has, I think at the bottom, it has here, this is a good picture because it has like the four petals on the bottom. And I really just started looking at a lot of YouTube movies and a lot of handbooks on teach yourself how to weave, to start understanding like how does this machine actually work. And I started looking at the patterns that they use for such machines. So I started thinking, here's actually what the pattern looks like, and there's like the three different I don't want to get too technical about like how looms work, but this was kind of my research, really like doing the research into like how does this work, and then finding ways to translate that into code again. So in here you see very straight examples, but then at some point I started see, can I distort this? Can I distort these fabrics a little bit? Can I tear it a little bit? Yeah. I think often like once I have a system set up based on something, I start to look at ways how I can break the system. So that's kind of, after I've done the reverse engineering and I've that system is ready, I start to break it. And I think for me personally, that's where the most exciting things start happening, especially working with code, because it's just so easy to kind of like rapidly iterate over things. Yeah, then it becomes exciting. And another project for which I did that was my prop with Arsenale for the project based on the GSPEP quilters. I don't know how many of you are aware of the work of the GSPEP quilters, but the G-Span quilters are a group of African American or collective, an informal collective of generations of African American women from Alabama, from a small town called Gee's Bend, and they've been making absolutely gorgeous quilts for generations now. I would say like 3-4 generations at least. This is some of their work. I personally think their quilts are absolutely stunning. Just the way that they work with colors, the way that their quilts are. There is a certain kind of randomness to it, but there is a system. So when I was introduced to their work, I immediately saw a relationship to generative art. As I kind of like scroll through it, you see recurring patterns and you see recurring themes. Because, for example, like this block here of these inward spirals, you also see it more here, but on a bigger scale, and you also see that coming back here. And there's some kind of like so there's these patterns that you see coming back, but at the same time there's like a randomness to them that you really can't control. That's because the way that they quilt, they always work with like scrap fabric. So they quilted with what was available to them. Maybe a certain fabric color ran out and they went on to use a different fabric to continue. So I was really, really fascinated with their work, and I was really honored that I got to work with them to turn their work into, from 4 quilters specifically, to turn their work into a generative system. One of those is Lucy P. Petway. And for this project, whereas like with the other project, it was very technical and it was very systematic how I went about it. I really went into like how does this loom work? What do these patterns, what does it everything mean? I really went into more of the technicalities. With this project, I think for me, it also maybe more in line with how the quilters work themselves. It was a lot more intuitive. I have spent hours on this website, specifically mostly looking at the work of the four quilters that I was working with, but also the quilters, the other quilters. But it was just looking at it and thinking of, and in the end, I made kind of like one master algorithm or master function the quilt, and depending on the variables that I added to that function, it could express the quilts of the different quilters. And I think the first time I kind of got quilts out of there that resembled the work, like some of the work that I had been looking at. Like I got really excited. And then again, what I also did with this project, once I had that solid system where I could kind of get things that represents their work, I started to break it. So here's actually the OpenSea page of the project, and I can kind of show what I mean. There is, this is an output that really kind of strongly resembles some of the quilts that, it's very recognizable with, yeah, there we go. It's very recognizable with what you maybe, it says my stream is still running. Cool. What you just saw on the website, it shows their, it's very representative of their work, but then they also have where the system starts to break down. And it also, I wanted to show both aspects where I think for me it becomes really exciting. For example, in this output where you can still see it is their work and what it is based on, but a lot more things start to happen. And that's where for me as a generative artist it becomes very exciting. Now, there was the question of, oh, that's such a shame you can't see what I'm sharing, Janie. I'm sorry. Weird. I'll send the image that I was looking at of one. Can you see a little bit?
Don't worry, I don't think it's an issue of your ability to stream. I think it's more like it doesn't
And I
work
can also
for
share the
phone
link to
Discord.
the website of the G-Span quilter, so you can have a look at their work as well. So you have an idea. Name. So yeah, that was my my G-Span project, which I really loved working on. So I guess then now this is like a nice segue into the question of Gen Art Studio, of where, like, what is the main component of generative art or fashion? Is it about making the final output something nice, or is the system the essence? I think if you ask a lot of different, if you like, all generative artists will give a different answer to this. So I'm gonna give you my answer, but I know that there's different different opinions on that. So it's not, what I say is not law. For me personally, it is still very important to get quote unquote a nice output out of the system. Whether that is expressed in a fashion item or in a pattern or in just a static image, a dynamic image. For me, it is important that the final output is quote unquote nice, to keep with that word, because I think also as a generative artist, often you set up your system and then you also actually spend a lot of time on curating or taming that system in a place where you feel that everything that the system expresses is actually something that you agree with. That is not to say that I don't think necessarily the system is not important or that the code is not important. Okay. Sorry, I see another question coming in. I think to a certain extent the code is important, but because I don't have a formal programming background myself, I'm not super strict or orthodox in that. But it's I do like it if the system itself is also maybe grounded in, for example, a particular algorithm that is very interesting, or yeah. I like your question. I think it's a bit of both. I don't have, although it's something that I think about a lot myself, and I have some opinions upon it. I'm not sure if I already have no, this is really my belief around this. Because there's some artists that are just absolute code wizards, and I can really, really appreciate that. Not sure if I count myself among them, and I might, in my own practice, be more focused on the outcomes, although very much do appreciate also the craft of the programming and the code. All right, I'm gonna read your questions again for a bit. Your swearing is now quite interesting, and the influence of G-Span is quite obvious. Could you please briefly tell, untechnical, please, what are the main rules dictated with the code here? I hope I haven't been too technical so far. More things about the bugs. Are there some resources that are easy entry points into making generative art, like taking a pre-existing image and putting it into a generative context? Maybe I can talk a little bit about that, like what is a nice place to start if this is something you want to get into. Yeah, P5 is a good place to start, indeed. Non-technically, what are the main rules dictated with the code here? The main, I'm gonna get a little bit technical, but the main underlying algorithm on this project is a rectangle subdivision algorithm, and I'll Google that and find like an image for you. Vision algorithm. Because if you look at the work of the G's band, actually what it is like one very big it's with recursion. I'm not sure this helps. Stay here. If you look at the work of the G-spans, it's basically one big rectangle or one big square divided up into smaller rectangles and smaller squares. And this is actually also something that is a very kind of like common algorithm you first start working with when working with generative art or working with a grid system and working with the subdivision of rectangles is kind of a also a very classic thing in generative art. And I think this is also why I thought working with the G's bands was so interesting, because there is also this overlay, not only in their practice of generative art, but also kind of this classic link to this, this really kind of like canon type of generative artwork, which is the subdivision of a one rectangle into smaller rectangles. And there's like different algorithms to do this, and I implemented like 3 different algorithms to do that, and combine those in different ways. um, if you would want to know more about the algorithm, let me know. I don't want to dive, like I said, let's not dive too much into the technical side of it. Mm. And then there is, oh yeah, Ben Kovac is also, he is a really, really nice generative artist. I really love his work, and very generous and nice person. Thank you for that recommendation. I haven't seen that one though. I've seen Tyler Hobbs's talk for Strange Loops, which is also pretty good, where he breaks down his reverse engineering of taking watercolors, painting with watercolors, and seeing how you can express that in code. But a little bit like, what is a nice jumping off point? Have another talk for that. Let's see. Yeah. Well, teach yourself generative art. Oh yeah, Tyler Hobbs in general is just his whole website is a really good resource. Then a very obvious one is the YouTube channel, The Coding Train by Daniel Schiffman. I think he's an amazing teacher, and I think he's hilarious, and he just makes it so much fun to learn. And what I also think is so great about his about the videos that he does, he just breaks down an algorithm and he gives you how it works, but then he really leaves the creative freedom to you, to then really take it to an artistic side. So I also really appreciate that that about his learning resources, and it's just you really feel you understand what you're doing in the way that he explains things. What is my opinion on gen art that imitates physical things, watercolor, etc.? As there's now a debate about that gen art should be its own thing and push its own boundaries. Yes. Thank you for that question. I do have an opinion about that for my own work and my own practice. I'm I'm not in the business of telling other artists what to do or not to do. Um, I am personally not very interested in imitating physical things. It's not something that I gravitate towards. That being said, there are some artists, for example, William Mapan is an example of this, who is capable of representing paint, and MP Cos can also beautifully render things as if they are painting. And I think it is absolutely incredible what they do from a very technical standpoint. And I think their work is gorgeous. I appreciate it both from like an aesthetic sense as well as from a technical sense. And look at it in that way. But I'm personally not very interested in trying to achieve that. I wouldn't say generative art shouldn't be representing imitating physical things, like if you think about it. But paintings imitate physical things all the time. Like, why is it okay for paint to imitate physical things in a way, from a skill kind of way? If you think about like the old masters who were drawing still life, it was all about, showing off your craft. I think in generative art, also the artists who are able to represent these physical things, they are really showing off a craft that takes quite a lot of skill. I wouldn't say like why is generative art not allowed to do that? Um, but I'm always quite interested in staying true to my medium. I'm very interested in the pixel. I like the screen as a medium. I haven't worked a lot with printing or anything like that. Um, what I'm personally more interested in is in turning my works into, for example, fabric and textile based works. Some of the works that I've made for the G-Span project are now turned into actual physical quilts again by one of the G-Span quilters, and I think that is just absolutely incredible. And for example, I can show again my like my work for the G-Span. This one is cool. In this project, I debated it a lot whether I wanted to actually make them look like quilts or not. It was a very important question for me in this project, which I went back and forth on. I also do have experiments where I added a lot of textures to these images, and they started to look a lot more like fabrics that you could touch. But I felt that because they were based on quilts already, the physical, I knew that whatever I was going to do on the screen, it was never going to approach the real thing. And I wanted to have the focus of this algorithm, and what the focus of my research question was is like, can I capture a kind of a legacy algorithm, or an algorithm that represents their legacy, that is able to reproduce their color choices and their patterns. I think because this was my focus of this project and what really interested me, I wanted to keep it very flat, and I wanted to really have it as a digital expression, as a digital counterpart. This is why it more resembles almost pixel art, and it's very flat, almost only pattern like. So for this project, it was definitely a very conscious choice to do it that way. Yeah. And what you say, like push its own boundaries, I think, generative art pushing its own boundaries. I also think it is pushing boundaries, if you are incredible with working with textures, for example. But I think it's also pushing its own boundaries if we start thinking about how can we include the blockchain and what the blockchain can do in our algorithms. How can we use time in our algorithms? How can we use animation? Like, what can a browser all do? How can we have the user interact with these, which is also all these things that you can do with code and working in a browser. So these are also all these other directions that we can push the boundaries. I see another person is typing. I think the awesomeness of those quilts comes from the asymmetry, composition, colors, and not some perfection, which, by the way, is the great what of generative art, to get it to look really casual, not repetitive noises, right? How do you get there? I don't know how I get there. Um, Not repetitive noises. I think if something that makes me think about this, if you say repetitive noises, the randomness looks too perfect usually. Can you elaborate on that a little bit more? the randomness looks too perfect. Because when I think, for example, about repetitive noise, you have the 1,000 oatmeal bowl problem. And that is a little bit linked to, for example, game design. If you're playing a game, let's say your PlayStation or in a computer or whatever, it's often like all these landscapes and flowers and stuff that are generated procedurally. You are maybe walking through a scene. So constantly, say you're walking over a path, the path is constantly kind of changing, but you constantly still see about the Berlin noise. Okay, I'll get there. You constantly kind of like the path is constantly changing, but it's actually also constantly looking the same. So this is also called the 1,000 oatmeal bowl problem. Bowl oatmeal. Let me see if I can Google that quickly for you. Okay. It's actually a very old Tumblr post, way back when Tumblr was still a thing. If you are going to generate, for example, 1,000 bowls of oatmeal, maybe every bowl of oatmeal is going to be a little bit different because it's going to have a little bit less milk or more milk, or a little bit more grains or less grains. But ultimately, kind of like every bowl is going to look kind of the same. If you actually want to start getting, if you only focus on that, if you're only focusing on the noise of maybe how those oatmeals differ in very subtle ways, you can say they're all different, but looking at all of them, they're not all different. And sometimes you want this. For example, if you have a game and you want to generate trees, you kind of want each tree to be the same, that the person going through the game is like, oh yeah, there's that tree again. But they're all just a slightly different. Oh yeah, that's good. I could keep talking forever, but maybe like a closing question. Also, don't want to bore you guys. Probably have to get on with your day. But I'll say like a last thing about like noise and it looking too perfect. Perlin noise is very recognizable indeed, and this is maybe a bit technical or maybe not too interesting for everybody. So I'll be quick about it. Quick about it. You could already start thinking about using simplex noise. You can start thinking about building your own noise functions, for example, with sine functions and cosine functions. And another way to get a lot more interesting noise is to actually layer noise on top of each other with different amplitudes and frequencies. So if you want to know more about that, maybe send me a DM or something. But there's definitely, I would personally use Perlin noise more of kind of like a layer of maybe texture than it is really something that I base my whole algorithm on, indeed, because it is quite recognizable. Yeah, that's me. Upper noise was just an example. Yeah, and to keep kind of like the oatmeal bowl as an example, just changing the noise a little bit won't differentiate all those bowls from each other. But if you start thinking about like, oh, if I make the size of the bowl bigger, smaller, the shape of the bowl, the color of the bowl, is there toppings on my oatmeal or not? If is the bowl already maybe half eaten or empty? Is there like a spoon in the bowl? Is the bowl on a table or just like standing on the floor? So, I think if you start thinking beyond that in your process and adding like more different parameters and settings. Going very small, going very big, blowing up your parameters usually helps. Yeah. There has to be a part that has to be manual. I better DM you. Yeah. I'm curious about what you're thinking about. I hope it was helpful for you guys. Hmm.
Thank you so much for answering so many questions. I hope you can hear me right now, but just in case if not, I'll type it out as well. But thank you so much for joining us for our AMA, and yeah, chat soon. Thank you,
Yeah, thank
everyone.
you so much for having me. I hope I didn't talk too fast. But
No, it's perfect.
all right, cool.
If people would like to reach out and ask more questions, would you be happy to answer via Twitter?
Like Twitter DMs?
Twitter DMs, or like what way would be best for if people have extra questions for you?
I'm gonna throw my email in here because that's where I'm most on top of replying, and otherwise Discord DMs is probably also the easiest place. Aside from Discord, I don't have social media on my phone and stuff. I try not to spend too much time on Twitter. So
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Have a
yeah.
great weekend,
All right.
everyone.
You too, guys. Enjoy. All right. Bye bye.